Let me ask you a question. Do you think you've ever done something purely selfless? Not mostly good, not good intentions. I mean purely selfless. No payoff, no warm fuzzy. Because if you're honest, you've never done it. This is another one of those foundational axioms. Everything you do is selfish. Even the things you're proud of, even the sacrifices, even the things you do for others. I'm not saying people are evil. I'm not saying compassion is fake. I'm not saying altruism doesn't exist. I'm saying this. Humans act to pursue their desire, just as any social animal would. They do what they believe will improve their own well-being and happiness. That's biology, human nature. It's built into our genetics. Nature has been running this experiment for hundreds of millions of years, and it keeps reaching the same conclusion. And if we don't get this right, if we lie to ourselves about how humans actually behave, we don't just get philosophy wrong. When people hear the word selfish, they think cruelty, narcissism, or indifference to others. That's not what I mean. Selfishness, properly understood, simply means this: to act from desire, but you choose actions based on how you expect they will affect you, your happiness, your identity, your peace of mind, your values. And we, like many social animals, will choose actions that we believe will increase our happiness or well-being, now or later, relative to other options. Sometimes that well-being is money, sometimes it's meaning, sometimes it's love, sometimes it's reputation, sometimes it's avoiding guilt. But it is always you choosing the action that best satisfies your internal calculus, even if it appears to be altruistic at times. You donate to charity, you get satisfaction. You save a stranger, you get meaning. You help a friend move, you avoid being the kind of person who bails. You take care of your kid, you love them, and your brain is wired to protect what you love. Even martyrdom, real martyrdom, often comes from a value structure where dying feels preferable to living in dishonor. That's still an internal payoff. So the point is, people aren't bad. The point is, people are motivated. People are consequential. People are reward-driven. And any moral framework that pretends otherwise is building a house on Fantasy Island. And selfishness is not immoral. It's how natural selection shaped us. Selfishness, in the biological sense, is not cruelty. It's not greed. It's not indifference to others. Selfishness is the pursuit of one's own desires. Desires for safety, meaning, status, autonomy, love, progress, competence, security, legacy. Every conscious action you take is downstream of desire. Even when you sacrifice, you are choosing the outcome that feels less intolerable than the alternative. That's not a moral failure. That's how the nervous system works. Now, here's the part that modern moral thinking refuses to confront. When you prevent a human from pursuing their own desires, especially through coercion, you don't just frustrate them, you trigger a biological injustice response. So in this chapter, I'm going to do three things. Number one, I'm going to show you how selfishness is not a flaw, but a biological constant. Number two, I'm going to show you how fairness and cooperation evolve because of selfishness. And number three, I'm going to show you why consent-based systems protect mental health, while coercive ones slowly break people. And to do that, we're going to start with a story that I think you already know, a story we've all heard growing up, and that's the Thanksgiving tale. In 1620, English settlers, the Pilgrims, sailed on the Mayflower seeking religious freedom. They landed in what is now Massachusetts, at a place called Plymouth. The first winter was brutal, with many pilgrims dying from cold, disease, and lack of food. They were on the verge of total collapse. Then along comes Squanto, a Native American who shows them how to grow corn, fish in the rivers, and survive. Pilgrims had a good harvest and invited the Native Americans through a 3-day feast, which became the first Thanksgiving. Sounds nice, right? A feel-good story about gratitude, friendship, and peace between two cultures. It's almost like a government-issued fairy tale, made to make you feel all warm and fuzzy. But here's the reality. That story is revisionist history. At best an exaggeration, at worst complete nonsense. The more important story, the one that actually teaches us about human nature, is what happened before the feast. When the Pilgrims first settled in Plymouth, they organized under a communal system. It was basically an early version of socialism. Everything was done for the good of the community, and resources were split equally among everybody. The idea was that people would work according to their ability and take according to their need. The goal was equity, not equality. Equity focuses on giving people similar outcomes, regardless of their contributions. Sound familiar? It is a collectivist approach supported by utilitarian naivety. Anyway, land was held in common. The food was pooled. The labor was shared. Output was distributed equally regardless of effort. This wasn't imposed by tyrants. It wasn't done out of malice. This was done by deeply religious, well-intentioned people who believed that suppressing selfishness would produce harmony. Sounds noble, right? But in practice, it was a freaking disaster, leading to severe food shortages and near starvation. It almost killed them. Fortunately, Governor William Bradford, the leader of the colony, kept records of what actually happened and documented this failure in detail. He observed that when men worked harder but received no additional benefit, motivation collapsed. The problem was, if one guy worked 3 times as hard as the next, they both got the same amount. Resentment built, especially among the young and able-bodied, who were doing the heaviest labor. Bradford noted that the men deeply resented being compelled to labor for other people's families without compensation. Women were pissed too. Because they were weaker, they were stuck with doing chores for other men, cooking, cleaning, you name it, but for others and under the threat of punishment. Not only did they see this enforced communal labor as degrading, they saw it as a form of slavery, and their husbands could do nothing about it. They were powerless against the community standards. Bradford noted that this system of enforced equality, where no one owned anything and everything was shared, was unnatural, inefficient, and destructive. When effort is disconnected from reward, people disengage. When labor is compelled, morale dies. The more they tried it, the more they realized how flawed it was. And now they were all starving. This outcome wasn't a product of laziness. This wasn't a moral failure. This was human nature responding predictably to incentives. You can see this in the animal kingdom, and sometimes it's ruthless. People love to point to wolves as symbols of cooperation, but a wolf does not hunt for the greater good of the pack. There is no wolf socialism. Wolves don't run equal outcomes regardless of contribution. Contribution matters. Incentive matters. Packs have cooperation, yes, but it's cooperation with accountability. It hunts because effort increases its chances of eating. Failure means starvation. Freeloaders don't get fed repeatedly. If a wolf consistently avoids risks, avoids the hunt, avoids contribution, it doesn't keep getting full benefits forever. In nature, chronic freeloading gets you demoted, driven off, or killed. That's not cruelty, that's reality. Effort follows payoff. Sever that link, and the whole system collapses. A wolf pack survives because contribution is rewarded and non-contribution is punished. That is survival. The Pilgrims didn't invent this lesson, they relearned it. By pushing for a socialist communal system, Bradford said it was as if they thought they knew better than God. But I say it's as if they thought they could outflank human nature. Anyway, after years of starvation, Bradford abandoned the communal system. Families were given private lots, they owned what they produced, and they bore the consequences of their own decision. The results? Immediate and massive improvement. Suddenly, people were motivated to work harder. Why? Because they got to keep the fruits of their labor. More crops were planted and harvested. The threat of famine disappeared. Morale skyrocketed. The colony was finally thriving, and it all came down to a simple idea that people work harder when they directly benefit from their efforts. Bradford reflected on this and realized that the communal system, based on utopian ideas from philosophers like Plato, was a failure in the real world. Today we know this progressive approach under different names, such as socialism and Marxism. He concluded that getting rid of private property and enforcing a communal lifestyle does not bring happiness or prosperity. Quite the opposite. It breeds resentment and laziness. The Pilgrims didn't become less selfish. Nothing about human nature changed. The system changed, and the Pilgrims became productively selfish. By aligning effort with reward, the system finally worked with human nature instead of against it. So how did this selfishness help the Pilgrims get better harvests? Well, this free market system aligned with our natural rights and based on consent allowed for direct payoff loops where effort equated to rewards. When outcomes track individual or family efforts, people invest more energy, planning, and grit because the payoff lands where the cost was paid. It also created ownership, which creates care. You guard, maintain, and optimize what's yours because your future self and your kids benefit from the long-term yield. Do you treat a rental as good as you treat your own car? This system also punishes free riders naturally. In forced pooling systems, cheaters don't get filtered out because the system protects them. Private allocation makes chronic non-contributors feel the downside. Also, reputation matters more when trade is voluntary. Once people can choose who to help or trade with, trust and reliability start paying dividends. Liars and slacker get fewer deals. This system also helped enable reciprocal altruism. Helping a neighbor with their fence or crop isn't saint mode. It's a long-term strategy. I help you today, you'll help me later. Also, this free market system allowed for the division of labor. People specialized, better tools, better planting, better hunting, because they were not watching their output get diluted into whoever showed up gets equal pile. Family investment is also a biological constant. People prioritize mates, children, kin. Systems that align with that reality get more consistent labor and longer planning horizons. And innovation doesn't get punished. When an upside or smarter method goes to the person who took the risk, you get more experimentation and learning. And voluntary generosity became true generosity. People still share, but as a choice, not an extraction. This is where morale and trust actually grow. Did you know that vampire bats literally share food? They regurgitate blood to feed bats that struck out. They share selectively, based on relationship history. Bats that don't reciprocate tend to get cut off. Translation: nature supports generosity when it's voluntary, trackable, and reciprocated, not when it's forced and disconnected from the contribution. That's the whole Pilgrim lesson in mammal form. So, we can see, as history has shown, as counterintuitive as it may be, when people are free to act in their own best interest, society thrives. Conversely, history is also filled with examples of failed attempts to suppress natural rights, especially the right to own property. It is an indirect form of slavery. Every time somebody tries, it ends up in failure or bloodshed. By recognizing the natural right to property, Bradford unleashed productivity, innovation, and cooperation. People acted selfishly for their families, for their futures, and the result was a booming harvest and a much happier community. This shift didn't just save the Pilgrims, it set a stage for what would become the American focus on individualism and private ownership. Kudos to Bradford for having the wisdom to see that the communal system was failing, and the guts to abandon it in favor of private property and free trade. Anyway, natural selection doesn't care if you feel good about the system you're enforcing. If it produces resentment, cheating, withdrawal, or rebellion, it's maladaptive. We can never have a happy society when the system is unjust. Our instincts for fairness, it breeds resentment and chaos. You see it in the animal kingdom, and you see it in us. You know, if you have access to 2 dogs, and you got a half an hour to kill, you should try this little experiment. You might learn something from it, and the dogs will be happy for it. Well, one of them will be. So get a bag of those low-calorie training treats, and you sit down with them, and you try to get them to do some simple little trick. Maybe, lift their paw. Something simple, very simple. As you're training them, and they're getting it done correctly, give each one of them a treat. Keep doing this for a few reps. Then, once they have it down, start pulling back the treats on one of the dogs. So you're going high five, dog's giving you a little paw, give him a treat. Go to the other dog, high five, dog gives you a little paw, give him nothing. Go back and forth and back and forth. See how long it takes before the second dog does not raise his paw and gives you like a nasty, disapproving look. It's kind of funny. Okay, let's get serious for a minute. That's not learned behavior. That's not culture. That's not ideology. That's evolutionary fairness detection. There's a famous primate experiment with these monkeys. 2 monkeys do the same task. If one gets a grape and the other one gets a cucumber, the cucumber monkey eventually refuses the payment, sometimes literally throwing it back like, take your communist cucumber and shove it. That's not politics. That's not social conditioning. That's an evolved cheater detection fairness system in social species. Because in nature, if you tolerate unfair trade, you become food. Social species evolve to detect when cooperation turns into exploitation, and humans are no different. When people sense they are being subjected to forced labor, unequal rules, arbitrary punishment, reward without contribution, they don't become virtuous. They become angry, withdrawn, anxious, and aggressive. This is why morality cannot be built on intentions. It has to be built on biological reality. And that biological reality is tied to our natural rights and our moral right to pursue our own happiness. And you cannot pursue happiness without consent. You can't feel fulfilled in doing something you were forced to do. You can't find meaning in labor imposed at gunpoint, literal or bureaucratic. You can't build mental health on coerced obedience. Which means the pursuit of happiness is not just a poetic phrase, it's a psychological requirement. Natural rights are the boundary conditions that protect consent. Life, liberty, property, privacy, parental rights. Remove these and happiness becomes impossible. Not philosophically, but neurologically. Remove these and altruism will almost certainly die as well. And let's quickly define and agree on the term altruistic. Altruistic means acting for the benefit of others, voluntarily, without being forced, and often at a cost to yourself. Motivation can still be selfish in the human sense, but voluntary is the key word. If it's coerced, mandated, or enforced, it stops being altruism and becomes compliance through coercion. Altruism is a chosen sacrifice. Forced altruism is a contradiction in terms. And there's yet another lesson we can derive from our Pilgrims and that first Thanksgiving. Bradford saw firsthand that when you force people into communal sharing, when you say you must be altruistic whether you like it or not, you actually undermine the whole spirit of generosity. They ended up with resentment and frustration instead of real community. Forced altruism can only be committed through coercion. It's a form of slavery. If consent is the foundation of moral interaction, then slavery is the exact inverse. And let's be clear, slavery is not just forced work. Pure slavery is the total negation of natural rights. As a slave, you don't control your life. you have no liberty, you have no property, you have no privacy, and any parental rights are decided by somebody else. This is why slavery is not merely immoral behavior within a moral system. It is the complete inversion of morality itself. It is the forced redirection of a human being's selfish drives away from their own well-being and towards someone else's. The slave still has desires, still has goals, still seeks happiness, but every avenue toward it is blocked or punished. Work not for yourself, but for another. Produce not for your family, but for a master or government. Obey not because you agree, but because you fear the consequences. That's not a historical anomaly. This is what happens whenever systems demand outcomes without consent. And you don't need change to create slavery. You just need a system that says your labor is owned, your preferences are irrelevant, and your refusal will be punished. That's why any legal framework that requires forced service collapses under moral scrutiny. Because morality cannot demand that someone act against their own rational self-interest through coercion. In our previous chapter scenario with the atheist, the Christian, and the Muslim on separate islands, it should have been clear that no man had a right to dictate another man's actions on their own property or control what they do. No man has a duty to serve another, nor does anyone have the right to steal the fruits of another's labor. You can see this, right? At a basic level, this logic should be apparent. Yet, the world seems to be missing this concept. And it's a simple concept. We see it in nature and the animal kingdom. Under chronic coercion, animals don't become better. They become stressed, hypervigilant, or they collapse into learned helplessness. That's not weakness. That's a nervous system adapting to a world where agency doesn't matter. So when you build systems that punish agency and override consent, you are quite literally engineering the biological conditions for depression, anxiety, withdrawal, eventually rage. Today, society preaches about the importance of mental health issues. Utilitarians talk about providing the greatest good for the most amount of people in terms of happiness, pleasure, or well-being. Progressives and liberals claim to fight for equality for all people, regardless of race, religion, or sexual preference. Christians and people of faith claim to support natural rights. And patriotic people here in the U.S. claim to support the notion of inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet all these groups fail when it comes to acting, influencing, or voting for individual rights that allow the others to pursue their own unique version of happiness. We implement rules that violate people's natural rights while simultaneously preaching that it is virtuous to follow the rule of law. But is it really virtuous? I don't see how someone can argue that. From an evolutionary perspective, happiness is not a reward for obedience. It's a signal system designed to guide organisms toward goals they value, mates they choose, alliances they consent to, and environments they adapt to. Remove freedom of pursuit, and happiness loses its function. Psychology defends the notion that autonomy, independence, and individual rights are not nice to haves. It's a requirement. Across decades of research, one variable keeps reappearing as non-negotiable for well-being: autonomy, the ability to make meaningful choices about your own life. People are mentally healthier when they feel they author their own actions. Depression, anxiety, and resentment spike when behavior is externally controlled, even if the outcomes are objectively good. Autonomy predicts life satisfaction independently of income, status, or comfort. Clinical psychologists understand that these forced good outcomes still cause damage. Therapists routinely see patients who have food, shelter, safety. They're taken care of to protect them from risk, and yet they're deeply unhappy. Why? Because happiness does not come from being protected. It comes from pursuing your own version of happiness and owning outcomes. As we discussed in previous chapters, human action, whether moral or immoral, comes from pursuing your desire to be happy. And selfishness is the pursuit of one's own desire. Alright, with all that said, let's go back to the island scenarios. We will now evolve our 3-men island scenario to a 200 island scenario, made up of 100 women and 100 men. One person per island, fully self-sufficient, no survival pressure whatsoever. However, in this model, every person begins alone, sovereign over their own body and their island. Groups don't exist by default. They form only when individuals decide that association beats solitude. And the island owners, or hosts, retain the right to decide who enters their space and under what terms. Not because they're morally superior, but because ownership without exclusion isn't ownership at all. So you can join groups, you can leave groups, you can host groups, or you can live alone. What you can't do is force yourself into someone else's space and call it justice. So let's talk about some of the groups that might be formed. And I'm going to go over about 10 of them that I think cover the scope of what we're dealing with in society today. So let's just say to live in this peaceful society, while retaining your ability to pursue your happiness as you see fit, you have to join the consent group. It's not really a community as much as it is a rule set, but you all have to agree on certain principles. Voluntary action, real consent, no force, fraud, or coercion, no natural right violations. Every other group exists only because this one is honored. The second one is the ritual and meaning group. This is where individuals voluntarily gather around religion, spiritual practice, tradition, shared symbolism. Entry is voluntary, exit is guaranteed. Meaning is chosen and never imposed. Then we have the open inquiry group. People form groups to debate ideas, challenge beliefs, pursue truth, use plain, reality-based language. No compelled conclusions, no protected dogma. Offense is permitted, coercion is not. Then we have the sexual autonomy group. Consenting adults choose relationship structures, sexual practices, non-traditional arrangements, sex work. No one outside the group has standing. Consent, not approval, is the boundary. Then we have the provocative art and speech group. Artists and audiences opt into offensive expression, blasphemy, satire, taboo speech. Exposure is voluntary. Being offended does not grant authority. Then we have the free association group. These are people who choose to live with same-sex couples, interracial couples, any voluntary household. No quotas, no guilt, no forced inclusion. Association without choice is meaningless. Then we have the self-destructive and foolish group. These are people who choose lifestyles that are unhealthy, unproductive, lead to suffering, ignore long-term consequences. They pay the price themselves. Bad outcomes do not justify force. Then we have the intoxicated and altered states group. These are people who opt into drugs, alcohol, psychedelics, risky self-experimentation. But there are no external victims, no forced participation, and risk is not a crime. Then we have the disgusting and degradation group. Voluntary participation in humiliating acts, dangerous contests, extreme behaviors. Disgust is not jurisdiction. If it were, freedom wouldn't survive a week. And then we have the compassion and protect group. This group represents some of the best impulses in human nature. These people here choose freely to feed the hungry, care for the sick, shelter the vulnerable, defend those who cannot defend themselves. No one is forced to help. No one is compelled to sacrifice. Compassion here is chosen, not extracted, and that distinction matters. This group does not exist to control behavior. It exists to respond to suffering, when invited, when needed, and when consent allows. They help because they want to, not because they're ordered to, not because refusal would be punished. The moment compassion is enforced at the point of a gun, it stops being compassion and becomes obedience. Protection is not the same as control. Care is not the same as command. This group proves something essential. You don't need coercion to get compassion. You need freedom. In fact, freedom is a precondition for meaningful compassion. Now, logically, and feel free to dispute my logic, all these groups will coexist peacefully, live in harmony, if they subscribe to the first consent group. Now, let me be clear, this doesn't mean that the islanders are making good decisions. They can absolutely make horrible decisions, stupid ones, self-destructive ones, short-sighted ones. Freedom does not guarantee wisdom, it guarantees choice. But here's the moral line that matters. As long as no one else is violating another person's natural rights and every interaction is voluntary, nothing immoral is occurring. Bad choices aren't crimes. Unhealthy behavior isn't a moral violation. And here's the part that I think modern society seems to forget. When people are free to make mistakes, others get to observe, learn, and adapt without being dragged down with them. That's how growth happens. That's how responsibility forms. And that's how societies mature, by letting consequences teach what force never can. Natural rights in the islands is not about happiness guarantees, but they will enable clean feedback in the form of consequences. And if everybody respects each other's natural rights, it will prevent predation, coercion, enslavement. And with those boundaries, people can fail, they can succeed, they can learn, and they can grow. That's evolution at a human scale. The 200 islands aren't just a moral thought experiment, they're a miniature version of evolution itself. When people are free and accountable, progress emerges. When outcomes are forced, learning and efficiency dies. Nature already ran this experiment. It knows the answer. Nature figured something out long before philosophers did. Each island is a variation. Each life strategy is a behavioral mutation. And the outcomes, the good and the bad, are the selection pressure. There are consequences. Some traits work, some don't. Reality gives feedback, and over time, what works survives. That process has a name: natural selection. Human freedom plays the same role as natural selection at the individual level. Natural selection is how species discovers what works. Freedom within natural rights is how individuals discover what works. When people are free to pursue what they believe will make their lives better, they learn. Not because someone lectures them, not because someone rescues them, but because reality answers back. Bad strategy, you're going to feel pain. Good strategy, progress. Adaptation follows. If you remove freedom, if you remove consequences, you kill the learning process. That's true in biology, and it's true in human psychology. Imagine we decide the islands are too harsh, so we guarantee outcomes, equal shares, no matter what the effort. Protection from failure, no matter what the choices. What happens? It's a Thanksgiving tale all over again. Effort collapses, adaptation stalls, resentment builds. Not because people are immoral, but because you broke the feedback loop their nervous system evolved to depend on. Natural rights exist for the same reason selection pressure exists in nature. They don't promise happiness. They protect the process that makes happiness possible. Life, liberty, property, consent. Those are guardrails that keep the experiment honest. We need a framework where people can fail, people can grow, and people can learn who they are. But once you start forcing outcomes, once you start mandating altruism, once you override choice, you're no longer improving the system. You're doing the human equivalent of stopping evolution mid-sentence, immorally, through coercion. And nature doesn't forgive that. It just ends the bill later, in depression, dependency, and decay. Freedom isn't chaos. Moral rights tied to natural rights is how humans adapt. And none of this is immoral, because none of it violates consent. And just because someone is sitting on their island, doing things that violate your faith, or committing acts you find vulgar or offensive, that does not give you or any other islander the right to stop them. And now let me ask you a critical question. Who gets to interfere? Do you think you have a moral right to interfere in this scenario? If you were one of the islanders, do you think you should be allowed to sail over to another island to stop behavior you dislike? You think it's okay to impose your values through force? What happens if somebody refuses? How much force is acceptable? Because I will argue that once force enters the picture, morality ends. Because now someone's pursuit of happiness is being overridden by violence. That person on the island has every moral right to defend themselves and their life and their liberty. Badge or no badge, majority vote or not, good intentions or not. And though I might not have the legal right, I definitely have a moral right to defend myself and my natural rights. So along those lines, let's talk about 3 other possible groups that cannot coexist in our framework. One is the morality enforcer group. This is the group that claims we know what's best for everybody. This group claims its purpose is to reduce harm and protect the vulnerable. They believe individuals cannot be trusted to make good decisions. Speech can be violence. Silence can be violence. Inequality is proof of injustice. Discomfort is harm. Risk is moral. And neutrality is complicity. They're the same ones who seek to regulate speech for safety, override consent for equity, restrict choices for people's own good, enforce inclusion to prevent harm, correct beliefs to stop misinformation. The next group I'm going to call the religious extremist group. This group is not defined by faith. It is defined by coercion, justified by doctrine. Religious belief by itself is not the problem. Voluntary worship, ritual, prayer, and moral guidance all fit comfortably inside a free society. The line is crossed when belief claims authority over unwilling people. This group includes individuals or movements that enforce religious rules through force or threat, suppress speech, belief, or identity in the name of divine truth, override consent because God commands it, punish apostasy, heresy, noncompliance, control bodies, especially women's bodies, criminalize consensual adult relationships, treat dissent as sin deserving violence. They elevate doctrine above your natural rights. Every abuse becomes justifiable. Violence becomes virtue. Obedience becomes morality. Suffering becomes righteousness. Faith without choice is not faith, it's submission, and that distinction matters. A church, a mosque, a synagogue, or a temple that people may freely enter and freely leave belongs in the ritual and meaning group. The moment force replaces choice, it moves here. And the last group is the predator group. This group is fundamentally different from every other group in the model. They initiate force. This is the group of individuals who steal property, assault bodies, rape, murder, rob, terrorize, and threaten through violence or force. They do not seek consent. They do not respect boundaries. They do not honor exit. Their defining feature is coercion. Every act in this group shares the same structure. One person overrides another person's will through force, threat, or violence, personal gain, domination, or gratification. This is not a moral disagreement. This is not a cultural difference. This is not a lifestyle choice. This is the direct negation of natural rights. This is where moral clarity matters. We cannot tolerate theft, rape, murder, or violent coercion because tolerance ends where the rights violations begin. We're going to talk more about predators throughout this series, but either way, these last 3 groups are incompatible with this moral framework, and to be frank, seem to be the source of a lot of moral tension and division in our society today. So in conclusion, let's sum up what we've learned here today. Humans are selfish because evolution made us consequence-driven, and our desires are what fuel our actions. That selfishness can produce cooperation or conflict depending on the rules, and it is the basis for every altruistic action. Systems that respect natural rights channel selfishness into productivity and peace. Systems that rely on coercion produce resentment, mental illness, and eventually violence. We also learn when people are free and accountable, progress emerges. When outcomes are forced, learning and efficiency dies. Natural rights aren't an abstract philosophy. They're a biological prerequisite for human flourishing. Ignore that, and no amount of moral language will save you. So, we've built a moral line for human interaction. Consent on one side, coercion on the other. And we've shown something else too. When people get to keep the fruits of their labor, when their agency is respected, humanity doesn't collapse. It tends to cooperate. But now we have to face the brutal truth that every ideal system tries to dodge. Not everybody plays the same game. Some people cooperate because cooperation works. Some people cooperate because they're decent. And some people cooperate only until they see an opening. Then they take what they want. So the next chapter isn't about good people. It's about people who weaponize good people. We're going to use game theory, the math of human interaction, because it's one of the cleanest tools we have for understanding cooperation, betrayal, retaliation, and forgiveness. We're going to use game theory, not sermons or slogans, to answer one question. What is the best strategy when predators exist inside the system? And if you're just tuning in and this chapter appeals to you, you need to go back to the beginning. You jumped into a series that's cumulative. And though the points I'm making may sound or come across as disparate or unrelated, they're not. This is kind of a wax-on or wax-off approach where I'm using Miyagi-Do tactics to build a foundation before we introduce more and more realism into the equation. If you're still with me, subscribe. Because you're not here for comfort, you're here for the truth. And with that, peace out from Virginia.